So if you're still fetching your data using useEffect, when a component is mounted, you run an async function here, or async method, when you set load in and you have to put the state, then eventually you just update the product, or maybe use a global store like Redux to store and actually retrieve the data later on. Well, you're doing it wrong. And in today's video, I'm going to give you my developer perspective on why you should avoid using useEffect and jump to something more of like React Query, a fully established library that takes care of handling and fetching data for you, and it handles the state behind the scenes. So all you worry about is just calling one hook. So React Query is a state management library that allows you to do so many things, from caching and from always updating the state behind the scenes on like window focus or reconnect. It has like network mode, even for offline or online, so many stuff. And if you heard somebody says, oh, I completely replaced my Redux store with just React Query, then do believe them, because that's absolutely 100%. And I was trying this out a couple of last week with real projects, and it's completely doable. I don't know how it feels like, but once you start actually using it, you're gonna start seeing and getting into the habit of using less code, way much easier API, and your code is going to be a lot more readable with like your team. And I absolutely enjoy like the agnostic API provides out of the box. So if you've never tried out React Query and never thought about actually giving it a try, this video may change your mind. So we got a basic application that actually shows and fetches like a products from a dummy API and actually just renders them. This is just like an e-commerce website. You can just take this as an Amazon or something. So as simplistic is just all it does, it fetches products and actually, renders them. And I kind of like went through and implement that using both ways. So first, using the regular classic useEffect kind of example, where you got your actual function in here, or fetch method, which is actually going to go ahead and fetch the product. It's going to get the products from the Axios in here API, and it's going to get products, and it's going to set that into the actual state. So whether you're using a global state like Redux, which is going to cover that in a second, and obviously when you're trying to fetch this, you go to the useEffect, you put like an empty area here to make sure that it only runs once the component is mounted. And of course, this is only going to be running once the component is mounted. And of course, going to do the fetch products, going to fetch the products, update the state, maybe check if it's loading or not. And obviously, is loaded in here is going to be implemented separately. A lot of stuff are going to be implemented separately. And last but not least, we just go through products, loop through them, and render every single one of these products. We're gonna grab from the actual API, and that's it. So this does actually look that simple. It's very simple, and there's no React person, React developer on earth that hasn't done this kind of way. I mean, we all went through this fetching process on how to fetch stuff and everything. I'm not saying it's bad, but it has some bad stuff, and also it can actually go wrong on the wrong path for particular reasons or particular scenarios. So I'm not saying this is completely bad, but it can go that sideways. So if I go back to the application in here and go and actually refresh that, let's see what we get on the console. So we first get component mounted, then we're gonna get start fetching, then obviously you're gonna get the products from the network in here, which is obviously gonna be just fetched from the API, and that is it. But what you need to actually focus on is, the component mounted is actually the first one we get. So in the code in here, we are actually waiting for the component to be mounted in order to actually start fetching the products, which isn't the actual best thing that you can actually do in the word, but this is still a pretty viable scenario. But in performance wise, sometimes it takes time because it actually waits for the whole components to mount before you actually do anything, and before you can start fetching the products from the API. And the second example we got in here is with the React query. Now here we're using the React query, which makes it a lot simpler. Now if you look at the code, just the first glance of the code, if you just compare this versus the other, you already know that the code with the React query in here is a lot simpler and way much easier to read. Now, let's say what the React query is actually doing. So you just use the use query hook in here, which all it does, you're gonna pass it through the fetch products and a unique key. So each query in here should have a unique key. So that's what we're doing in here. We're just doing products, and this is our unique key. And you can pass in multiple ones, and you got like the fetch product. So the fetch product is actually our fetching product, which is as any other fetching kind of function. All it does, it uses Axios or fetch to grab the data, and all it does simply just returns the actual products or data. We're doing that for the cart or everything. So the products in here, that's exactly what's happening. So you just pass it the fetch product that's going to be returning, and of course there should be a promise, and I'm putting stale time in here, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. Now if you look down here, we got the useEffect, and that's where we've printing the component mounted. Now if I go back to the application, and now I'm using the React query instead of the useEffect example, and I try to refresh this one, and there you go. Now we get obviously the first render, we get that to be loading, then we fetch the products. We start the actual fetching before the component actually mounts, which makes it super awesome. But if you look at the timestamps for each event in here, so this one, like, it has exactly the same time, just like 1 millisecond difference between this and the other, which isn't a really big thing you should consider. But for some rare case scenarios, the components or our component actually takes a quite longer time to mount, which kind of makes this a little bit kind of a winner when it starts fetching before the component actually mounts. But most of the times you're not going to find problems. Now the second thing why I actually love to now use React query instead of the regular classic useEffects, where you got a fetcher in here and you call it a useEffect, is the code readability, and as well the maintenance of the code and the flow of the code. Now, let's say for example, this is the useEffect, right? Now, every single time you try to fetch something on every single component, you gotta just do this fetch component. Obviously, you can export this to like an outer scope as we did before, but still you need to actually handle the state, the inside state in here, which obviously you need to set products. Maybe you can return product later on, but maybe like side effects like set loading, which is just a side effect of when it starts and when it stops. Then you need to actually trigger the set loading, then set it to false once that actually finishes. So it kind of very cumbersome. You need to keep that function right over here and always keep it updating, and it's very, very bad. As well as you have to hold all the state from errors, loading, and everything. And if it gets a little bit more complicated, the actual fetching code is gonna, gonna interfere with the component itself. So this is the component, right? It's very small. This is all it does. It renders products. All it needs is actually products, an array of products, and it renders that. Why keeping this giant thing in here? It makes no sense, right? Now, on the other hand, if you look through React query, it's a lot simpler. I mean, I don't know how I didn't know that any sooner before, but it's actually a lot simpler. So you use query, you're gonna get all in here, plus the bazillion kind of stuff that you're going to be returned with that if you look at the declaration. But you get like is error, you're going to get the error, you're going to get the actual data, whether it's success or not, is loading, much more. And all it does in here, you can configure it per query in here for like the stale time, for caching and everything. And you just pass in the fetch products, which can be shared among all the components with the use query. So it's just a simple hook. Once you get that, obviously you don't need to actually use effect or something. I just put that for testing, but you can just all do like is loading and the is error, and both of these are going to be like, returning particular like different kind of components, or you can use them throughout the code in here without actually manipulating and managing the state per component. So personally, when I started using React query, I found myself a lot more productive with how I put the code, and the code is a lot cleaner, and the components are like separate from the logic of fetching and everything. And obviously I can use the use query in here throughout the application without having any problems. And the third favorite part about React query for me is it kind of like 80% of the time eliminates the use of a global store like Redux or stand or something. Well, you may actually still use it, but not with the actual data, like the fetch data from a server. You can keep that with React query without the needing to populate that global store and share it with the rest of the components. So let's say this is actually a simple application where you got an e-commerce store. You can go to add to cart, you can add it to cart, and we got our cart. It'll actually pop up from here alongside some separate component here that prints out some statistics about the filters or something like this. Like we got a total products with 30 products on here, and the number of products over $300 are 9 products over here. So I got 2 examples in here. The first example with a global store, which has Redux, and it uses Redux in here with a store. The second example, which is the actual React query without using a store. Now let's start with the use store in one in here. Now with the global store, it's just the simple one in here. You got use upstate, which uses the store, which is just using the create slice in here, which is from the Redux toolkit you're probably familiar with. So that's basically our store. We set the products, we set the cart, we fetch that from the cart and everything. We got the initial state, and we just export that, and we just put it as a provider. That's what it is. Then we simply in here, we got the products, and to actually set the products, once we fetch them, we got the dispatch. So we do dispatch, set products, and we actually set the products on the global store. So the reason we set that on the global store and not local in here, because we got other components like the info components or the cards to actually access the products and show the products or show you statistics or anything. So it kind of like needs to access that piece of data or that piece of state globally. So for example, here we go to the info, we got the app selector, we got the product, and here we're accessing the product to do some calculations to check, oh, products like over the $300 or the number of products on this list or something like that. And when it comes to the cart in here, for the cart drawer, we need to access the product, and as well as we need to fetch the actual cart. So are we doing fetch cart product? We grabbing the cart in here, which is we having this fetch in here, which is going to be returning, obviously uses Axios and everything. And this is a sure thing. This will never change because this is the standard of fetching data from an API. Now, once you get there, you're going to go dispatch, set cart to update the store and set the new cart. And later on, you can go to like cart products in here to actually be able to access the products and filter through them and know exactly which products are added to the cart. I mean, this is working absolutely fine. It works really flawlessly without any issues and everything, but you get with a problem when you try to refetch. So you have to use a kind of like a scenario where you do a post or something, you update the data like on a cart, like you add an item to a cart. When you refetch, you're going to face a problem. Now, if you jump to the React query part, we're doing exactly the same thing. We haven't changed anything because this is our use query, and our query is always going to be there without any issues. And we do, the same thing in here. Now, if we jump to the info, now we are actually always, remember, we are with the React query example. Now, within the actual info in here, because we're not storing the data in a global store, we can always use the use query, passing it the same unique ID as we did before, and with the same stuff like fetch products or maybe the same config. And this use query won't actually go ahead and dispatch or do the fetch and actually do another HTTP request. No, it's just going to use that from the cache that the other query has already run for us, which is the use query in here, which can be used as a global store because that particular hook actually shares the same data and knows to grab the same piece of data for you without refetching the data, which kind of makes it absolutely great because you don't have to save it on a global store. The only store for the truth is actually the use query and your fetchers in here and your cache, and all of these kind of things are handled for you by the use query or the React query itself. And obviously you can do the same thing. We can use memo, we can go through the products, filter them, do whatever, and exactly the same thing in here without the other rubbishness of using a global store and saving it and storing it. And we're all actually dealing with and manipulating actual server data, not a client data that we need to worry about. Now for the carts in here, we're doing basically the same thing. We're not storing anything. We're doing cart query to fetch the cart because we've never fetched the cart before. So this is actually the only request going to be like made out. And we're going to get products query to actually get the same products as we did before in here. There's no other request going to be like fetched or something. This is the same thing going to be used from cache, and obviously cache depends on like so many factors on React query, so you need to know about that. But the peanut butter in here is actually, it all works fine without a global store. Now if you go back to the actual example in here, which uses the React query without the actual global store, and I try to go ahead and actually refresh, let's see what it does in here in the console. First, it does a render, then it's gonna start doing fetching products, and it only does that once. So that particular fetching Axios HTTP request is only being called once. And it's curious in here, all of the data in here is actually shared. So you got the products info is being rendered correctly, and we got the cart in here, which has obviously the added cart product. But if you look at the console in here, it's only gonna fetch products once, and it's only going to fetch cart once, and it's just going to do that once and it's storing the cache, and it's going to manipulate everything for you. So you don't have to refetch every single time, and it's actually clever enough to know when it needs to fetch, when it needs to invalidate the cache, and when it needs to actually force a completely brand new refetch. Now, you're probably wondering how the React query actually handles cache, and when does it invalidate, when does it refetch, does this particular caching mechanism is going to cause me problems with my data, and it's not going to be fetched like that often with, without using React query, without using a cache mechanism, how all of these kind of things are actually working. So for all these answers is actually the perfect place to actually find your answers and actually read through is the documentation, and particularly this section where it says important defaults. So this one tells you exactly what are the defaults of the React query. So it uses same defaults without actually aggressively telling you to do something bad for your actual users. So for example, in here, if you look at the stale time is actually when you got a query, when you firstly fetch something, how long does it gonna be still to be fresh in milliseconds before it's gonna be considered a stale state or a stale data. And obviously, a stale data is gonna be refetched the second time the query is gonna be called, or the second time you're gonna be refocusing on a window or a particular thing. So for example, when you got new instance of a query, this is when the query is going to be sent again if the cache is invalidated. So like a new instance of a query mount, Windows refocused, network is reconnected, or the query is optionally configured to be refetched in an interval. Now, if you've seen it before, using it with like, for example, the fetch product, I'm always setting stale time. Now I changed this to 3000, which is in milliseconds, that means 3 seconds. So our data, once it's fetched, it's only going to be considered fresh, and it's not going to be refetched only for 3 seconds. And once the 3 seconds are going to be like elapsed, it's going to do refresh as soon as possible. And for example, here for the current, I set it to a minute. So if you look at that, for example, right here, we got the actual, like for example, here, this is actually the React query DevTools, because they got their own DevTools integrated. And I have got the console in here open by the side. Now, if you look at this, we got the 2 types of data we get from the React query. We got product and we got cart. Now, cart in here is considered to be fresh because it has the interval for that set to a minute. But when it comes to product, it's not fresh, it's stale. And as soon as like I click on, for example, I unfocus the window and I click on the window, I get that right away, because that's exactly what it does. Like when a window is refocused, it tries to fetch a stale data and make it fresh as soon as possible. And another example in here is, for example, you got a stale data, and when that data is going to be refetched is when a new query is mounted. And what I mean by a mounted is a new component with, like using the query, for example, the products query. For instance, we got the cart query in here, or the cart component using that query, and that the cart component isn't actually mounted just yet. So if I click on it, it's going to become mounted, it's going to be fresh, and of course, it's going to fetch the product. So it's going to like refetch the products and put them in the cache. Now, last but not least, what I want to look at real quickly is the actual React query mutations. Now, mutations, from the name of it, and it knows like it's changing a piece of data on the server, and that's exactly what it does. So mutations are meant for HTTP requests that are like post, put, delete, update, something that changes the status or any piece of data on a server, not like a GET. Now for that, you use the useMutation query. You're gonna get an object in here, which is cart mutation, and it has a pretty simple API. First, it takes a callback, which is anything that you're gonna be passing to the mutate function later on, like an object or something, is gonna be available in here, like the new product. And you can return Axios post to something in here, and that's simply what it is. And there are a couple of hooks that you can actually list it on, for example, on success, or maybe you can do on error and stuff like that. So for example, what I'm doing on success is I'm going to use the query client, which I'm grabbing from another use query client hook. And through the query client in here, I can manage so many stuff, and particularly the cache. Now I can do query client, invalidate queries, and I can invalidate a set of queries. Or I can do query client refetch queries to force refetching or running the queries for a particular state.